Hi, my name is Joe Wheaton. I'm from Utah State University, and I am going to talk to you about low-tech process-based restoration principles. What I'm going to share with you is all in the design manual, mainly in Chapter 2. So it's really an elaboration of Chapter 2. And Chapter 2 doesn't present new science, but cites a lot of the supporting science. I will show you a bunch of citations as we're going through, but I won't make too big of a deal of those. And it's also summarized in the first few pages of the Pocket Guide. So first off, before we talk about low-tech process-based restoration, we need to back up and just talk about process-based restoration in general. It's a concept that's been around in the literature for a while. 2010 Beachy article is actually often cited as the origins of this, although some earlier work by Dave Sear, who's a co-author on that, and some others, probably where the term originates. And there are 4 principles in that paper that talk about process-based restoration. The first is to target the root causes of habitat and ecosystem change. Second, to tailor restoration actions to local potential. 3, match the scale of restoration to the scale of problem. And 4, be explicit about expected outcomes. So these are pretty good principles. These are sort of hard to argue with. However, they don't really tell us all that much about what is a healthy system, nor do they really, in most of these cases, explicitly kind of guide our actions. So we're going to just adopt these in adopting process-based restoration. But what we want to talk about is for low-tech process-based restoration, which recall is to address structurally starved riverscapes. We want to elaborate on this a little bit. And so we're going to do that by starting with 4 Riverscapes principles. And I'm going to go through each of these, and we're going to just use these to help us understand what constitutes a healthy riverscape. We've got a principle that has to do with space, one that has to do with the role structure plays in forcing complexity, one that is basically our 2 favorite words in the natural sciences. It depends, and the 4th is about inefficiency. Okay. So just a reminder, we talked about this earlier today, but riverscapes are the part of the landscape that could plausibly flood by their rivers and streams in the natural flow regime. So this is inclusive of active channel and or channels and or active floodplains, as well as we'll see in the planning module, the inactive portions of that riverscape. Okay, so principle 1, streams need space. So healthy streams are dynamic, they regularly adjust in their valley bottoms, etc. So to give a river, sort of thinking of it as a living river, its space is really to give it room to adjust, to give it room to exercise during floods. And so we need to either reclaim or conserve that space to flood. And here's some examples of what Byron and others coined the term freedom space. And there's lots of different variations on this and lots of different ways to look at this. But it's really something that's pretty implicitly defined by streams need space. How much space do they need? Well, that's defined by their valley bottoms, and that goes back to that definition we just had. For example, in Colorado, they've been doing a lot of fluvial hazard zone mapping. It's another way of approximating some of this. So, principle number 2, structure forces complexity and builds resilience. And if I'm being totally honest, this is one of those principles that you could unpack into, 3 or 4. This is going to be the one that takes us the longest to explain. There's a lot buried in here, but if we just look at this figure, well, what's the structure? There's a big beaver dam across here and a couple little secondary ones. That's making much more complicated habitat, which is making it resilient to disturbance. So let's unpack the component pieces. key processes are structurally forced. So this little diagram is of the structurally forced pathway to complexity. And if you look at the virtual field tour that accompanies tomorrow's Module 3, this is laid out in some examples there as well. And so the idea is you have structural elements. So this is just anything. The ones we're going to focus on in this workshop are wood accumulations and beaver dams. They could be natural like that, or they could be unnatural. It could be a bridge pier, Detroit riprap, a shopping cart, anything that gets in the way of free-flowing water. And when it does that, it forces changes to the hydraulics. Hydraulics are just a fancy way of saying moving water that has velocity and depth, okay? And so it changes the velocity, it changes the depth. Now remember, velocity is a vector, not just a scale or quantity. So that means that, it can be things like shunting flow, splitting flow, backing flow up, spreading flow out, creating convergent flow, etc. So when you vary those hydraulics, you vary that amount of flow energy, that amplifies geomorphic processes. And geomorphic processes are basically erosion, deposition, transport, and the one that kind of catches people off, also storage of sediment. So those are your geomorphic processes. And in so doing makes more diverse geomorphic units. And so that ultimately results in more complex habitat, which is thought to support more biodiverse riverscape ecosystems. So this is this kind of structurally forced pathway to complexity, all right? It's the first kind of two components of this principle. So wow, if we look at those component processes, it's helpful to think about the processes as verbs versus, the things that they may create or influence as nouns. So we've got hydrologic processes. So things like flooding and attenuation, augmenting, hydraulic processes here of slowing, deepening, speeding up, shunting, splitting, backing up, those sorts of things. Geomorphic, building up, depositing, deposition, cutting down, eroding, or storing that topography and sediment. And then biologic, so grow, survive, reproduce, die, right? And so we heard from Colin earlier a little bit about the stream evolution triangle that really talks about how this portfolio of these three things kind of shifting. And I believe Mark also talked a little bit about that. So are these the P that we want to focus on in process-based restoration? These hydrologic, hydraulic, geomorphic, biologic, these component processes, and there can be very specific examples of these. Well, we could, but it's actually easier, kind of like analogous to focusing on a keystone species like, I don't know, a beaver or a salmon as an indicator of overall health. The key processes we tend to focus on in low tech are wood accumulation and beaver dam activity. So let's just unpack that. We've got this silly logo, process-based restoration. So what does that mean? So the processes right here of wood accumulation and beaver dam activity as verbs, really. And then the nouns, here the low tech part, building PALs, building BDAs, building other structures to initiate those processes, to mimic them and promote them naturally taking place. So let's just kind of look at a simple example. We saw this when I was talking earlier about an example of a structurally starved, I think I called it a bowling alley. So we can go to that bowling alley. And what this is a topographic map that we've run through our geomorphic unit toolkit. You don't need to do this. This is just a just conceptual example. All GUT does is derive geomorphic units. Fancy way of saying things like pools, bars, planar landforms. So what we've got here in this is a system that's dominated, if we follow this long profile through, by something that's this light cyan and yellow, right? That's mostly what we're dealing with as we go through here in this sort of bowling alley. Well, what are those? If we take a closer look, runs and rapids. So basically two planar units sort of plain bed bowling alley garbage. One's steeper and one is shallower. Okay, so this is a plain bed dominated system, and it's starved of wood, and it has limited interaction with its floodplain. So process-based restoration, as we saw in the introduction to low-tech, adds things like structure, like wood. These happen to be post-assisted log structures, okay? So that's the structure forcing complexity. And it's so this key process of mimicking and promoting wood to pile up. You can see a bunch of wood accumulation piling up on some of these. Is creating more complex hydraulics, which in turn are creating deeper pools, more pronounced bars, a more interesting habitat. Okay, so that's the first kind of 2/3 of this principle. So what happens? This is again, you saw this before. That's our pre-project. It's dominated by some pretty weakly formed bars on the side, and most of it's just this bowling alley of habitat. Now what? Well, a bunch of blue and some little orange. Well, what's going on here? And a lot more brown. What's going on is every single little piece of wood, every single wood accumulation, in this case post-assisted log structures, is forcing a response, and it's making more interesting topography. It's increasing the variability of hydraulics, increasing the geomorphic processes of erosion and deposition locally, and leaving in its wake much more interesting habitat. Okay. So the last third of that second principle, I apologize, is about resilience, that structural forcing builds complexity. The complexity is resilience. Think of the complexity as resulting in, instead of a riverscape that's just made of inorganic material, just sediment, it's making a complex riverscape that is literally carbon fiber. It's a mix of sediment and organic matter, and that matrix is all sorts of glue that is more resilient. So when we're talking about resilience, we need to think about resilience of what? Water, wildlife, working lands, to what? So resilience is just the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties, toughness, or another way of saying it, it's the inverse of sensitivity. It's a lack of sensitivity to a disturbance. So these are the sorts of disturbances that we face throughout the West: fires, droughts, floods. And so what we're talking about is riverscapes being more resilient to those disturbances, and in turn making some of the things that society cares about also more resilient because they are dependent on those riverscapes. So this is an example that I'm not going to actually go through. I'm just going to encourage you to, in detail at least, encourage you to check out Jeremy's talk on this in Module 2 tomorrow, when he expands on resiliency. But basically what we have here is resiliency defined on the vertical axis, years since restoration. And in this paper that Nick Silverman and a bunch of us published, that Jeremy will review tomorrow, basically showed that you can increase resiliency with adding structure, such that in this case, the resiliency of green groceries, production of vegetation in the valley bottom, is no longer sensitive to precipitation. And Jeremy will share you the details of that. I'm going to share with you a dumber, easier example, which is from a big fire that took place a couple years back up in Idaho, and this is a really complicated scientific phenomena, so pay attention closely. That phenomena is water does not burn, right? So what are we looking at? We're basically looking at a fire that barreled through this landscape and burned pretty much the entire riparian and upslopes to the ground. In some areas, pretty high severity. In other areas, not a lot of fuel to make it too high severity. But what's going on here? Well, there's a beaver dam complex, and everywhere where we saw these active beaver dam complexes, they were filling up this valley bottom sponge and either acting as refugia during the wildfire, i.e. resilient to that wildfire, for livestock, so it doesn't become barbecue, and wildlife, Or in some cases during the wildfire, it was actually a broad enough valley bottom, not here, that it acted as a fire break. Here it may have just slowed the advance of it as it jumped over this, but the important thing is it didn't burn. And so afterwards, we have immediate habitat, and these areas really don't change that much. Emily Fairfax has some wonderful videos and some wonderful work out of her PhD describing this phenomenon. So our next principle, principle 3, is that the importance of structure varies. And it turns out it varies based off of things that we can predict. That's basically hydrogeomorphic setting. So all you really need to know is if you're comfortable saying how important, for example, in some places like this top one, these confined headwaters, wood accumulation plays a major role. In other areas, beaver dam activity plays a major role. In other areas, this partly confined main stem, the flow regime plays a much bigger role than structure, kind of overwhelms the two. So how important the things that we just talked about in principle 2, structure, are, depends. So we've got this sort of built-in scaling for principle 1. Well, how much space does a river need? It needs what's defined by its valley bottom, which can be mapped. And then in the case of how important structural forcing is, this varies based off the hydrogeomorphic setting. And if you're comfortable with that, it's basically these are different reach types. And so the colors here in these dots correspond to the colors on the lines. And you can get a feel for where this makes sense. If you really want to do a fancy job on this, you can become or hire a geomorphologist, and they'd be happy to show you what it depends on. But we can just leave it at it depends, okay? And that's our cop-out. And then principle number 4, sorry for the mislabel here, is inefficiency is healthy. So hydrologic inefficiency is actually the hallmark of a healthy system. And to illustrate this, I have the LA River on the lower left, which is a beautiful example of engineering and particularly making it easy to calculate discharge with, for example, Manning's equation, because we basically have no roughness other than the algae growing on the concrete. So it's nice and smooth, and this is a very efficient conveyor of water out of that system. It turns out that mess on the right, this beaver dam complex, this is a beaver dam, that's a beaver dam, that's a beaver dam, oh, I don't know, there's 15 of them in here. That carnage there is a much less efficient conveyor of water and turns out to provide amazing habitat and be very, very healthy. So I'm going to just illustrate a couple of ways in which this plays out. 1, how does flow change with this inefficiency with structural forcing? So here's a meadow, whoops, apologize. And at the top, we have flow coming in. At the bottom, we have flow going out. And in red, I've got a bunch of beaver dams that were put in here and are obviously causing overbank flooding. The light blue line is the outline of the old channel the year before the beaver built all these dams, okay? So this is just a kind of conceptual example. This is actually some data from some beaver dams in Belgium, but conceptually, it's pretty much a nice example. So this is a hydrograph. So what I have on the vertical axis is flow, and on the horizontal axis is time. And in blue is the flow coming in at the top of the reach, okay? And so what we can see here is flow going up and down. So these ups, these are peaks in this case associated with little high flow events, okay? So storm driven in this case. And then the green is the flow leaving at the bottom of the reach, okay? And so this is flowing through a beaver dam complex, a bunch of dams in series and parallel. And so what happens? Well, the first thing to notice is that there's lower peaks in the flood. See this difference in volume when you integrate underneath here? This is literally how much flow is attenuated within that reach from the flow rate coming in to the flow rate going out at the bottom. And then what happens is that we see extended elevated base flow on the periods in between, okay? So we think of this as the water magic trick. So this water magic trick, this is some work that Karen Bartelt, a graduate student of mine, is working on in her thesis. And she's trying to come up with a way to quantify this simply and a way to think about this. Okay, so this phenomena is on the left, we have a picture which corresponds right here. This is looking upstream, so it's from downstream looking up of this reach here in August 2019. This is at base flow. This is the same reach a few years prior at the same flow. Okay, and so what we have here is the valley bottom outline in yellow, and then we have inundation extent in these colors that are mapped. Okay, and right here, roughly 5% at the same flow is inundated of the whole valley bottom, and it all consists of a class that she's calling free flowing, right? So just efficiently drained water, efficiently drained riverscape. Then we come down here, and beaver build these dams. Okay, you're seeing them in the photo, and they actually spread all the way out across this valley bottom. And that results behind the dams in some ponded water in dark blue. It results in some structurally forced overflow flooding of both floodplain and inset channel surfaces. And we still have some free flowing sections in between. So notice the size of this pie, or you can look at it this way with the bar plot, increases. So we go from roughly 5 to roughly 20%. This is at the same flow. So think about that for a minute. This diversity of flow types, structural forcing, right, is leading to a diversity of residence time of water in this system. And this is what we mean by the magic trick. The magic trick is I don't actually have any more flow here. Even if there is a tiny elevation of base flow, there's no more water. If I integrate water over the course of the whole year, hell, I may have more evapotranspiration and evaporation, but the timing is totally different. And not only is the timing of that flow different, typically benefiting, for example, irrigators in the American West, if we're talking close enough to where they're extracting from. But the amount of aquatic habitat is way more. This is the same flow. So that's what we mean by the magic trick. And, I spent most of my career trying to argue how much, geomorphology matters to biota by saying, habitat quality matters. And this is some work that you'll hear Nick Bowis present tomorrow in the science module 2 from Bridge Creek. And the upshot of it is basically this water magic trick that I'm referring to, a bunch of structural forcing, in this case by beaver, led to a population level response in salmon. And Nick will do a better job of articulating and explaining this, but the point is that creating a bunch more quantity of habitat is often going to be a really important driver for getting positive aquatic, and then also a lot of the upland species and wetland species that depend on these systems. Okay, so we're halfway through in terms of our sort of principles. So we've talked about riverscape principles. So these 4 principles help us understand what it is that constitutes a healthy riverscape. So just take a moment, read those. Streams need space, structure forces complexity, builds resilience, the importance of structure varies, and inefficient conveyance of water is healthy. This, we think, actually holds in any riverscape. Intermittent riverscapes, ephemeral riverscapes, etc. Partly because we have the it depends clause and it's all scaled to the size of the valley bottom. But this is a way that we can describe what constitutes a healthy riverscape and have expectations that are appropriate. Okay. Next, I'm going to walk you through 6 principles that are going to guide how, in the case of low tech, we undertake our actions. All right. So, principle 5. It's okay to be messy. On the right, we have some tidy pals. On the left, we have some messier pals. And you know, you don't have to spend all your time making things look perfect. Spending more time providing a bigger party, providing a bigger meal to that system, more structures, is going to be helpful. Also, natural wood accumulations, natural beaver dam activity are a little messy, and in that messiness, we get amplification of that principle too, that structurally forced complexity. So beaver like to make messes, so can you. That messiness is critical to ecosystem health and its resilience. So this was what Mark was getting us to appreciate, as well as Colin, in talking about the missing reference condition of stage 0, or as Mark put it, soup. Principle 6, there is strength in numbers. So if any of you are basketball fans, a few years ago, we absolutely agreed that strength in numbers, this little stolen logo from the Golden State Warriors, this rebuild year is maybe not quite the same, but what we mean by strength in numbers is here's a map of a small portion of a larger restoration project that Steve Bennett is going to talk about tomorrow, the Soton. So this is just showing a couple miles of this, and all those little symbols, those are structures. This is way more structures than we see in standard restoration practice, okay? So there's a bunch of different types, but just the density, right? You got to hit these things hard. And so in doing so, you have a lot of redundancy and an ability to scale up potentially to the scope of degradation that I talked about earlier. This video I'm going to show right now. We won't show it in the live version. I'm just going to refer people to it. And this video takes a couple of minutes. And what I like about this video, we're panning through this this example of a project up in Idaho. Thank you, BLM and the Office of Species Conservation. And you can see a lot of structures, right? A lot of beaver dam analogs. And this is, on the tail end of some spring runoff. These posts and these beaver dam analogs are really effective at varying those hydraulics, getting stuff out onto the floodplain. These are riparian plantings now completely inundated. And so what I love about this video is it really reinforces this principle. This is what density looks like, okay? This is someone that took the same workshop you're in right now a few years ago. And this video, goes on and on, kind of like me, right? Can't get to the point. And on and on and on and on. And that's how you all need to be thinking, whether you're going to be doing this as a restoration practitioner, whether you're going to be permitting stuff. We have massive, massive degradation of riverscapes. We need to be thinking about approaches that can scale, that let processes like this flooding, this structurally forced flooding, and then hopefully beaver to take over, to really, and look at this, we're grabbing floodplains, we're reconnecting channels all over the place out here. This is just this anastomosing stage 8 and 0 mess. So I love that this video gets boring. I want to challenge all of you to be thinking about creating boring drone videos because they keep droning on and on and on and on and on and on. So in just a second here, get down, this is the bottom of the project, and then he's going to pan back upstream in just a second. Right? That's a respectable scale project, right? And actually, we could do way bigger ones. So, oops, looks like I just accidentally got carried away there and brought up the chapter. It's a good time to mention that the PDFs of all of these, which are available on the website, are hyperlinked. And so you can go and pull any of these references that you see us referring to in these slides. The other part is all about of strength in numbers, is all about building the workforce. That's what these workshops are about. We have 1,000 people registered for this. We've been teaching workshops on this stuff for the past eight or 9 years, And a lot of people are going through these workshops and learning low-tech techniques, and that's incredibly important. Okay, that's what's going to help scale this. Number 7, just think of this as that foodie mentality. Use natural building materials, right? So we don't want to put things in like T-posts or, anything that's heavily fortified, in preservatives, if you want to use the, health food analogy. Things that are going to not break down over time. We want instead things that we might be able to naturally find there or that will decompose naturally. So if we use things like fence posts, don't use pressure-treated fence posts that can leach contaminants into the stream. Use untreated, peeler cores or something similar. A lot of cases we don't need posts, but the ingredients that you use what's available. If you've got a bunch of willow right next to you, great, use it. If you've got turf mats, great, use it. If you got juniper, you got conifers, maybe you got conifer encroachment into an area, use it. Use what's close by. That's going to make a big difference. In the West, there's a lot of concern about conifer encroachment, and largely because of fire suppression. We've changed our fire regimes, and so we have a lot higher densities. In this example, PJ, pinyon juniper, and so we're combining upland treatments where there's thinning and removal of PJ in this example, and using that as the material to bring down in. Beaver will use these things as building materials if they're forced to. If they've got stuff that also tastes good, juniper don't, they'll use that instead. But we see them building out of sagebrush. We see them building out of just a huge diversity of materials. So use what's near. Principle 8, let the system do the work. This is stolen directly from Bill Zeedyk, his book, Let the Water Do the Work on Induced Meandering. So geomorphic work is really the work we're referring to, like erosion and deposition instead of grading. But we say, instead of let the water do the work, we say let the system do the work because, another agent in that system, it's not just the geomorphic processes, but the biotic processes of what beaver do, and also wood accumulation. There's a great quote from Jared McKee at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that I just love. He says, well, what if restoration was about stream power doing the work, not diesel power? And he's actually got a great paper that I think is either in press or soon to be accepted that actually goes through the actual calculation of stream power versus diesel power and some really fun sort of thought exercises on this. But let the system do the work. We don't have to do it with fossil fuels. Deferring decision making to the system. This is principle number 9. So one way you can think about this, it's transferring decision making and liability over to an ecosystem engineer. They decide how high to build, when to maintain, when to let it go, when to repair a breach or a blowout, when to not. This is an example where all we've done is passively just put a trapping closure on harvesting beaver, and then let beaver make some of those decisions about how to manage that system. Another example, in standard restoration practice, which is really inherited from engineering design, where we have to create grading plans and figure out exactly, with specific cross sections. Okay, so if I want to do a floodplain reconnection, like, well, how do I size the channel? What slope is it? What's the width? What's its dimensions? What height do I set the floodplain to, et cetera, et cetera? Well, the beautiful thing with letting the system do the work and deferring that decision making is you don't have to decide. Maybe you put in a structure designed to blast a bank like we have here, but you don't have to decide how far it erodes. You can have some expectation that it's not going to erode it probably more than a channel width, but you don't have to make that decision. The flood decides for you. The system decides for you. The accommodation space that's created here, that's building an inset floodplain that's being colonized by vegetation, you don't need to decide what to grade that to. The floods that you experience will set that stage for you, okay? And ultimately, our most arguably important restoration principle, principle number 10, that helps keep our eye on the ball is that self-sustaining systems are the solution. We heard from Ben Goldfarb earlier. And this is not actually from the book Eager, but from an article he wrote in Science. And this is a cartoon that they redrew some of what we were doing out in Bridge Creek that you can hear Nick Bowis talk about tomorrow. And what we have are this idea of adding structure, right? Artificially, right? Those structures focusing on accelerating the riverscape and or channel evolution models that Colin talked to us about, in this case, widening and aggradation. That then making it easier for beaver to get a stronghold and start promoting the process instead of just mimicking it of beaver dam activity. So instead of mimicking it with our artificial, structures, they are promoting it, and then eventually getting to a situation where it's self-sustaining, where dams and beaver come and go, but you're maintaining an overall high level of structural complexity, which is building that resilience. So that self-sustaining concept is really important. So we want to get out of the business of always being in mimicking and promoting mode, right? So that's what I mean by what's your exit strategy. How long is it going to take you, and what's it going to take to get to that point of sustaining? So think explicitly about how your restoration actions immediately mimic a process quickly, relatively. It might be the next flood, or it might be immediately, in the case of some structures, promote a process. And then how do they eventually sustain that process? Okay. So one of the ways that you'll learn about in Module 3 is that we do this and we build the expectation managements for it, is we think about what's the zone of influence some structures, a collection of structures being a complex, might have. And that zone of influence, in this case, this is a few little BDAs in which beaver were released into, and how quickly, in this case, a few months, did they get out to this zone of influence and start flooding up that valley bottom. So in review, we talked about Riverscape Principles that helped us. We had 4 of them that helped us identify what constitutes a healthy riverscape. And then we have these restoration principles that are more tailored to guiding what you do, your actions in planning, design, and implementation and adaptive management for low-tech PBR. So it's okay to be messy. There's strength in numbers. Use natural building materials. Let the system do the work. Defer decision making to the system, and keep your eye on that ultimate goal of a self-sustaining system. Okay, so that is the conclusion of the principles talk. And what we're going to do before we get into the actual Q&A session is I'm going to give you a little quiz. And so this quiz, we're going to just flash through some slides here, and you're going to answer some questions about what principle it represents. So if you're taking this after the fact and watching this video, all you would do is below this video, click on that quiz, and you'll see is this a restoration or a riverscape principle? And if so, which principle or principles does it represent? So each one is going to have the 10 choices of those 10 principles. What does this represent? And you just try and fill that out. This is just a zoom in to this same little reach here, okay, for this guy. What principle does this represent? What principles does this represent? Okay. What do you think? And then, of course, this, okay? And so in doing that, I hope that helps you just kind of think about, and you could take any picture really, and think about how it represents your riverscape principles of health or your restoration principles. And with that, I thank you for your time.